the project that I chose to look at comes from my own practice as a landscape architect. I work in regeneration for my sins, and I had been working in areas with high indices of deprivation over a number of years, and had been thinking about how my tastes and the tastes of a lot of the people that I was working with were not exactly the same. And I read a study by Cabe about people from black and minority ethnic groups being underrepresented as park users in the UK, and I thought this was rather interesting. And is this the slide changing thing?
Yeah.
Okay.
Or you can just touch the screen.
Okay, so just to sort of launch into the presentation, people from ethnic minorities are underrepresented as park users in the UK. There is a similar issue in the United States of America and other what you might call Anglo-European sort of dominated cultures around the world. The statistics that I based what I've kind of used as my park counts to see if this was actually kind of true or is just some strange thing was what was generated by the Heritage Lottery Fund. People who applied to the Heritage Lottery Fund for money to improve their local parks had to present user counts, and one of the things that they were asked to do was to kind of measure who was visiting the parks in terms of their ethnicity. How this count was carried out is very variable across from park to park. There's no kind of standard methodology, so the figures could be kind of critiqued in some ways. However, in general, the difference between the surrounding population in terms of their ethnic diversity and who is in the park is generally just a few percentage points, but there are some parks where there's very extreme differences between who's in the park and what the ethnic profile of the surrounding catchment is. And one of those parks is actually Victoria Park, which is very close to the Olympic Park, where the statistics said that the catchment area had a BME population of 35%, but only 3% of the users of Victoria Park were of BME backgrounds. The case study that I looked at found that ethnic minorities visit parks less often than people who claim white British ethnicity. And what their study specifically looked at was whether that was correlated just with income, that it was actually an effect of poverty that was making people time poor, so they didn't have the leisure time to come to parks. And their study indicated that no, actually ethnicity was a far more significant factor than income alone. So does it actually matter? Well, public funding goes into public parks. If there's a process of exclusion going on, then obviously that would matter for social exclusion, for social justice. But there is also quite a lot of research out there that looks at health benefits that are allied with access to parks and green spaces. And so there may be significant implications in terms of mortality rates and lifespan if people are being excluded from access to green space through some kind of process, policy or other. So what did the research say? People from BME groups in the UK are more likely than white British people to live in areas of deprivation and to have less access to green space. So you would think that if you were going to create a park in a deprived area, such as the Queen Elizabeth Olympic Park, that you would be trying quite hard to make sure that that park was meeting the needs of an ethnically diverse community, such as we find in the East End of London. The research that's been done into the observed phenomena that BME groups are underrepresented in as park users indicate a number of different kind of theories. One is that it might be normative preferences. That's not exclusion, but just cultural difference, that people with different ethnic backgrounds don't necessarily want to go to parks to the same extent. However, there was significant evidence in the research as well that there were barriers to use, and there was substantial geographic variation. So there's no kind of consistent level at which people from different BME groups go to local parks, and there were a number of stories about people feeling that they couldn't go to the park even though they wanted to. There's also correlation with a lack of parks in areas which have high BME populations. This is actually correlated with income. And there's a theory that people get used to not going to a local park. They don't have it in their area, so that when there is one, then they don't go there. But actually, again, the papers that are out there show that people will travel quite a long way to go to parks, to particular parks. They may not go to their local park, they might actually go to a more distant one, or they might not use a park even though it's very nearby. And then there's another theory that it's about the acting out of unequal social relations. So it's about territoriality, who has power in the local area, whether people can visit or not. and that parks are quite often very much unregulated spaces, and that there's a lot of racism and fear in society. And again, I mean, I think that this is probably one of the more realistic and sort of uncontestable in some ways of the theories, but there was a lot of variation from park to park. So what I found, I'm a landscape architect, I deal in the design of space, and I was thinking, well, all of these studies, they're looking really at these effects as if it's only people, but is there no variation in the space? How does the space actually impact behaviour? Is there something particular about that? So one of the things that I had studied for a long time is about cultural landscapes and about the underlying politics of space. And just looking at the difference between a French landscape and an English landscape, this isn't a very major distance in terms of culture between France and the UK, but there's certainly a huge difference in the type of space that represents a whole series of ideas. So park space isn't uniform. Do we actually exclude people through design? And I thought it was important to look at not just the users but also the place factors and the underpinning ontology about space. And I just wanted to bring up this idea of the 18th century English landscape school, where a sort of sense of liberty in politics is also represented by a kind of a liberty in landscape, and that a kind of feeling that somehow liberal economics and liberal politics is emblematic in a kind of a natural landscape that hasn't been manipulated into geometric form. And so the Earl of Shaftesbury in Moralists in 1709 contrasts the beauty of unspoiled nature, as he sees it in the picturesque landscapes that are in fact heavily constructed and improved, and contrasts that with the formal mockery of princely gardens. And I'll kind of come back to that in a little while. So one writer that I looked at very much as an undergraduate was Raymond Williams, who kind of was very significant in cultural studies in the 1970s. One of the things that he looked at is how British legitimate cultural capital has a romantic view of nature and an identification of the free soul with solitude that you would find in wild places, and that then it also embedded within the British legitimate culture is this kind of ambiguous relationship with the city and a dislike of the crowd. And so there's a sort of a sense in which being alone in nature is what you should aspire to, and being together with the crowd is something that isn't aspirational. But that should really be kind of contrasted with other cultures who would more typically associate the countryside with backwardness and see the city as the centre of culture, power and sophistication. So here's my case study, which is the subject of the entire conference today. The Queen Elizabeth Olympic Park. The slide's a little bit faded out, but the Olympic Park, the sort of green space lies here. Victoria Park, which I mentioned, is over there. There's another number of green open spaces, Walthamstow Marshes up at the top, Wanstead Flats, down here the River Thames, the O2 Arena, just to sort of set it into its sort of spatial context. As we know, the area is very ethnically diverse. The park was claimed to be one of the largest built in Europe in the last 100 years, in the UK in the last 100 years, and it was set out as being intended to benefit local people. It first opened after the Olympics. The North Park part of the park opened in July 2013, and the South Park opened in April 2014. And I was researching with communities and with the designers of the park, and then on the site looking at user counts in the area after that period. So I was talking to people from 2012 on, and then visited the site after it opened. So it's a mixed methods case study. I did a questionnaire survey. I did focus groups with community members. We're specifically chosen to try to have similar demography in terms of age, in terms of gender, in terms of income, education, but to differ in terms of ethnicity. I did a spatial analysis. I did interviews with people who were involved in the development of the park itself in terms of policy makers, people who could influence the shape of the space. And then subsequent to the opening of the park, I did some user counts in the park. So I'll briefly dash through the spatial analysis. One key element of who uses a park is how close it is and how accessible it is to people. The choice by the designer could have put the park in any location within the space, but the design that won the competition placed the park as a sort of narrow strip right down the middle of the site. As a consequence of that choice, the park is basically distant from everyone who lived in the area before the games, and is largely disconnected from everyone who lived in the area before the games.